There are moments in life when everything looks normal on the outside, but inside, something quietly breaks. Not all pain announces itself. Some pain simply waits, patient, invisible, until you forget who you are trying to become. This is a story about courage, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands attention, but the quiet courage it takes to stay true to yourself when the world keeps asking you to be something else. It's about the strength required to let go of borrowed identities, failed versions, and old fears, and about how healing doesn't arrive as a miracle, but as a choice, made daily. In a quiet riverside town lived a man named Caleb Rowan, and without realizing it, he was slowly disappearing from his own life. Caleb Rowan was not unhappy in any obvious way. That was the problem. He lived in a town where mornings arrived gently, sunlight slipping through curtains, the river breathing slowly beside the road. His days followed a rhythm that rarely surprised him. Wake up early, make the bed, drink coffee from the same chipped mug, leave the house at the same time, smile politely, speak only when necessary. From the outside, his life looked disciplined, stable, respectable. Inside, it felt like a room where the lights had been left on for years, but no one was home. Caleb had learned slowly and without realizing it how to blend in. He learned when to nod, when to agree, when to stay quiet. He learned how to become useful without becoming visible, safe without being known. Somewhere along the way, he decided that being unnoticed was better than being rejected. He wasn't weak. He worked hard. He showed up. He did what was expected of him. But every night, when the noise of the world softened and the town went still, a strange heaviness settled in his chest, an unnamed ache that no amount of discipline seemed to cure. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was absence. Caleb stood at the edge of his own life, watching himself perform it well. He once believed he would be more, not greater than others, just more him. There had been a time when he spoke freely, when his thoughts felt alive in his mouth, when his dreams felt possible, even if they were uncertain. But life had taught him to be careful, careful with his words, careful with his ambitions, careful with his heart. So he built a version of himself that could survive disappointment, a quieter version, a smaller version, one that asked for little and expected less. That version paid the bills. That version earned approval. That version kept him from standing out. And yet, every time someone asked him what he wanted, his mind went blank. Not because he didn't want anything, but because he no longer trusted the answer. Caleb told himself this was maturity, that everyone eventually learns to compromise. That identity is something you outgrow, like childhood fantasies. Still, there were moments, small, disobedient moments, when the old self knocked softly. A pause too long before answering a question. A tightening in his chest when he said yes, but meant no. A quiet envy when he saw someone else speak with conviction. He ignored those moments. He had learned how. Because courage, to Caleb, had always looked like risk, and risk had always felt dangerous. So he chose certainty over truth, routine over reflection, acceptance over authenticity. And standing there, moving through life unnoticed, unchallenged, unchanged, Caleb didn't realize the cost. He didn't know yet that forgetting who you are is not a single moment. It's a slow agreement, one silent decision at a time. And the hardest part isn't losing yourself. It's convincing yourself that you never had anything to lose. Change didn't arrive dramatically for Caleb Rowan. It never does when you're running from yourself. Instead, it came disguised as improvement. He began waking earlier, working harder, saying yes more often. He filled his calendar with responsibilities and his silence with productivity. There was comfort in movement, in always having somewhere to be, something to finish, something to prove. Discipline became his language. If he couldn't explain who he was, he could at least show that he was reliable, consistent, needed. He measured his days by output instead of meaning, by completion instead of connection. And for a while it worked. People noticed. They praised his work ethic, his calm demeanor, his dependability. They trusted him because he never caused friction. He became the kind of person others leaned on, steady, composed, unquestioning. Every compliment felt like proof that he was doing something right. Caleb mistook approval for purpose. At night, he planned his next day with military precision. Lists, timelines, goals. The structure gave him a sense of control, as if order itself could fill the hollow space inside him. He told himself that this was strength, that discipline was the cure for doubt. And in small ways, life improved. His body grew stronger, his finances steadied, his reputation sharpened. From the outside, his life looked like a quiet success story unfolding exactly as it should. But success has a strange way of revealing what it cannot fix. There were moments, brief and uncomfortable, when Caleb would pause in the middle of a task and feel an odd disconnect, as if he were watching someone else live his life. The achievements didn't land the way he expected them to. They didn't echo. They didn't stay. They passed through him like compliments through glass. He noticed it most when he was alone. When the day's noise faded and the checklist was complete, the silence returned. And with it came the same question, sharper now, because he had done everything right. Is this it? Caleb answered the question the only way he knew how, by adding more. More work, more discipline, more distance from anything that felt uncertain or emotional. He told himself that feelings were distractions, that wanting more was ungrateful, that purpose would arrive eventually, as long as he kept moving forward. What he didn't see was the trade he was making. Each step toward external progress pulled him further from his internal truth. Each achievement reinforced the mask. The more efficient he became, the less honest he felt. But honesty required courage, and courage still felt like danger. So he kept building. Not a life, but a performance. A version of himself that functioned perfectly and felt nothing deeply enough to be hurt. Caleb believed he was becoming stronger. He didn't realize he was becoming harder to reach. And beneath the discipline, beneath the progress, beneath the quiet praise, the part of him that once dreamed freely waited, patient and unheard, for something to finally break. The collapse did not come with noise. There was no shouting, no dramatic goodbye, no single moment that felt worthy of being remembered. That's how it fooled Caleb Rowan. It began as an ordinary day, one he had planned carefully like all the others. The same early wake-up, the same routine, the same quiet confidence that if he followed the steps, everything would remain intact. But life doesn't always break where you're looking. By mid-morning, something shifted. A conversation that ended too quickly. A decision made without him. A polite tone that carried finality beneath it. Words were spoken gently, almost kindly, but they landed like a door closing. What Caleb had built for years was no longer his to carry. Not because he failed loudly, but because he had become replaceable. The realization didn't hurt at first. It felt unreal, like hearing bad news through a wall. He nodded, thanked them, said the right things. He even smiled. Discipline held him together. He walked outside and felt the world continue as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, people laughed, the river moved on without pause. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that something essential had just been taken from him. He told himself it was temporary, that this was just a setback, that discipline had carried him this far, and it would carry him through this too. But that night, something cracked. He sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life designed for efficiency. Clean surfaces, straight lines, no clutter, no warmth. And for the first time, the order didn't comfort him. It accused him. Without the role he had clung to, Caleb felt exposed, unnecessary, as if the structure he built had been holding him up, and now there was nothing underneath. He reached for his routines, repeated them precisely, but they felt hollow, like reciting lines from a script after the audience had left. This loss was different. It wasn't just about what he had lost. It was about what had been revealed. He saw it clearly now, the truth he had avoided for years. He had built his identity around usefulness, around being dependable, around being needed. And the moment that need disappeared, so did the version of himself he recognized. Caleb realized with a quiet terror that he didn't know who he was without function. The mask had cracked. The progress had stopped protecting him. For the first time in a long while, discipline could no longer distract him from the truth. No amount of effort could rebuild what had just collapsed, not because it was taken away, but because it had never truly belonged to him. That night, sleep didn't come easily, and somewhere in the stillness a frightening thought surfaced. If this can be taken from me so easily, what else have I been holding on to that isn't really mine? Caleb Rowan woke the next morning as if nothing had happened. Not because nothing had changed, but because accepting the truth felt heavier than pretending it hadn't. He followed his routine with even more precision than before, as if repetition itself could rewind time. The bed was made sharply. The coffee brewed exactly the same. The clock still ruled his movements. If he could keep the structure intact, maybe the loss would loosen its grip. Denial doesn't always look like refusal. Sometimes it looks like discipline taken too far. Caleb told himself stories. Reasonable ones. Temporary ones. He convinced himself that this chapter would pass, that his effort would be noticed again, that the collapse was just a misunderstanding waiting to correct itself. So he held on. He revisited old emails, old plans, old versions of himself that once felt certain. He replayed conversations in his mind, searching for the moment he could have done something differently. He measured his worth against a past that no longer existed. The future terrified him. The past felt safer, even if it was painful. Letting go felt like betrayal of his effort, of his sacrifices, of the years he had spent becoming the man he thought he needed to be. If he released that identity, what would remain? So he clung harder. He forced himself to stay busy, filled empty hours with unnecessary tasks, organized things that didn't need organizing, improved things that didn't matter. Productivity became a way to avoid grief. But grief has a way of waiting. At night, when his defenses weakened, guilt crept in. Guilt for not being enough. Guilt for wanting more. guilt for believing that discipline alone could protect him from loss. He blamed himself in quiet, merciless ways. If I had tried harder, if I had spoken more, if I had been different. Yet even as he punished himself, another truth whispered beneath the noise. The life he was trying to return to had been suffocating him. That realization scared him more than the loss itself, because if the past wasn't right, then all his effort had been pointed in the wrong direction. Still, Caleb wasn't ready to release it. Not yet. He stood at the edge of change and refused to step forward. He stayed loyal to who he had been, even as that version of himself continued to dissolve. Denial wrapped itself around him, not loudly, not dramatically, but gently, comfortably, like a familiar coat worn long past the season it was meant for. And in that holding on, Caleb didn't move forward. He stayed suspended between who he was and who he might become, exhausted, frozen, and slowly running out of strength. Because holding on to the past doesn't stop pain. It only delays the moment when pain demands to be felt. The days began to blur. Caleb Rowan stopped noticing time in the way he once had. Morning and night lost their meaning, merging into a quiet stretch of existence where nothing demanded his attention and nothing inspired it either. The discipline that once carried him now felt like a weight strapped to his chest, something he dragged rather than chose. He withdrew without announcing it. Messages went unanswered. Invitations expired quietly. Even the river he used to pass each morning felt distant, like a memory instead of a place. Isolation didn't arrive as loneliness at first. It arrived as relief. No expectations, no explanations, no performance. For a while, the silence felt merciful. But silence, when stretched too long, becomes a mirror. Caleb found himself sitting in rooms with nothing to do but listen to his own thoughts. And the thoughts were not kind. They questioned everything he had believed about strength, discipline, and worth. They asked him who he was without usefulness, and offered no answers in return. He felt empty in a way that scared him. Not broken, not shattered, just hollow. He would sit at the edge of his bed in the dark, hands resting uselessly in his lap, wondering how a life could feel so heavy while containing so little. The effort it took just to stand up some days felt enormous. The will that once pushed him forward had quietly left. This was not the dramatic rock bottom people talked about. There was no explosion, no collapse in public view, just a slow sinking. Caleb realized that he had been living for years in preparation for something: approval, security, validation. And now that it was gone, there was nothing underneath to catch him. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even sad. He was tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, a thought settled into him with terrifying clarity. I don't know how to live for myself. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought stillness. And in that stillness, Caleb understood something important, something painful, but necessary. He could not outrun this moment. He could not discipline his way out of it. He could not pretend his way forward. This was the place where all distractions failed. The place where change becomes possible, not because you're ready, but because there is nowhere left to hide. Caleb sat with the emptiness and, for the first time, didn't push it away. He didn't fix it. He didn't label it. He simply stayed. And though he didn't know it yet, this quiet surrender, this willingness to feel without escaping, was the lowest point, and also the turning point. Caleb Rowan did not go looking for wisdom. It found him while he was doing something ordinary. He had left his apartment simply to move his body, not with intention, not with hope, just motion. The air was cool, the kind that carried the smell of damp earth and unfinished rain. His feet carried him toward the river without him deciding to go there, as if memory knew the way better than thought. He sat on a weathered bench, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes unfocused. The water moved steadily, indifferent to his pause. Watching it brought no answers, but it softened the noise inside him. That was when the voice came, gentle, unhurried. "Busy day?" Caleb looked up, startled. An older man stood nearby, holding a paper cup of tea. His clothes were simple, worn without apology. His presence felt calm, like he had nowhere else he needed to be. Caleb hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." The man nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. He sat at the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. He didn't pry, didn't rush to fill the silence. They watched the river together. After a while, the man spoke again. "Funny thing about water," he said. "It keeps moving, whether you're ready or not." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not a realization, just recognition. The man turned slightly, his eyes kind but clear. "Most people think courage is about pushing forward," he continued. "But sometimes it's about admitting you've been walking in the wrong direction." Caleb swallowed. He hadn't said anything about his life, yet the words landed exactly where they needed to. "I thought if I worked hard enough," Caleb said quietly, surprising himself, "everything would make sense." The man smiled, not knowingly, not sadly, just gently. "Effort matters," he said, "but effort without truth only builds stronger cages." That sentence stayed in the air between them. Caleb felt exposed, but not judged. The man wasn't offering advice. He wasn't trying to fix him. He was simply naming something Caleb had been afraid to say out loud. They sat in silence again. Before standing to leave, the man added one last thing. "You don't have to become someone new," he said. "You just have to stop abandoning who you already are." Then he nodded once and walked away, leaving behind nothing dramatic. No instructions, no promises, just a quiet truth. Caleb stayed on the bench long after the man was gone, replaying the words, not obsessively but thoughtfully. For the first time since the collapse, something inside him loosened. Not hope, not clarity, but permission. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to be honest. Permission to begin, not by adding more, but by letting go. The river kept moving, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel the need to chase it. Rebirth did not feel like relief. Caleb Rowan had expected some kind of emotional release, a moment where everything suddenly made sense, where the weight lifted and clarity rushed in. That didn't happen. What arrived instead was quieter, almost disappointing. Responsibility. Not the kind he was used to carrying, the external kind tied to expectations and performance, but an internal one. The responsibility to live honestly even when honesty felt uncomfortable. The next morning, Caleb woke without urgency. For the first time in years, he didn't reach immediately for structure. He sat on the edge of his bed and listened to his breath. The silence didn't scare him as much anymore. He asked himself a simple question. What am I doing today that actually matters to me? The answer was small, almost fragile. He went for a walk, not to clear his head, not to be productive, but simply because he wanted to feel the ground beneath his feet. He ate slowly. He turned down an obligation that once would have felt impossible to refuse. These were not dramatic acts of courage. They were quiet refusals to abandon himself. Caleb began setting boundaries that no one applauded. He let some connections fade without explanation. He allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to soothe it. Discipline remained in his life, but it changed its role. It stopped being a shield. It became a tool. He disciplined himself not to overwork, not to numb emotion, not to perform strength when what he felt was uncertainty. Each day he practiced showing up honestly, even when no one was watching. Some days that honesty felt like weakness. He doubted himself often, wondered if he was being selfish, questioned whether this slower, quieter version of life would cost him opportunities. The fear of becoming irrelevant still whispered in familiar tones, but something else was growing beneath the fear. A steadiness. Caleb noticed he was sleeping better, breathing deeper, listening more, especially to himself. The emptiness he once feared began to feel like space instead of absence. Space to rebuild, space to choose. He didn't announce his transformation. He didn't explain it to anyone. He simply lived differently. And slowly, the man who had blended in began to reappear. Not louder, not bolder, but more present. Rebirth, Caleb learned, is not about reinventing yourself. It's about returning to the part of you that never left, only waited patiently for you to stop running. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as familiarity. Caleb Rowan noticed it in small, almost reasonable thoughts. The kind that sounded practical, sensible, protective. They spoke in a voice he recognized, the same voice that had guided him safely for years. You're getting comfortable. Don't lose your edge. You're falling behind. Old habits don't announce their return. They slip back in quietly, wearing the disguise of wisdom. Caleb felt the pull to overcommit again, to prove himself, to return to the version of life where approval came easily and identity felt defined, even if it was borrowed. There were days when structure tempted him to become rigid again, when discipline tried to turn into punishment. He noticed how quickly the mask waited to be worn. One evening, he caught himself planning weeks ahead with unnecessary intensity. The familiar tightness returned to his chest. Not pain, pressure, a signal he had learned to recognize. This time he paused. Strength, he realized, was no longer about pushing through discomfort. It was about listening to it. Fear tested him in subtler ways, too. It questioned whether his new pace was laziness, whether his honesty would cost him respect, whether choosing peace meant choosing less. Some days he almost believed it. But Caleb had changed in one important way. He no longer ran automatically. He slowed down long enough to ask better questions. Is this discipline or avoidance? Is this effort or fear of being seen? Consistency became his proof, not the dramatic kind that others notice, the quiet kind that reshapes a life from the inside. He chose to rest when his instinct was to overwork. He spoke when his old self would have stayed silent. He accepted uncertainty instead of trying to control it. Fear didn't disappear. It never does. But it lost its authority. Caleb learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear decide who you become. Each time he chose presence over performance, the grip loosened. And though the struggle remained, it no longer felt like a battle against himself. It felt like practice. Wholeness did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, the way morning light fills a room before you realize it's there. Caleb Rowan didn't wake up one day feeling complete. There was no sudden certainty, no permanent calm, but there was something new, a sense of alignment he had never known before. For the first time, his inner world matched his outer life. He moved through his days with less urgency, not because he cared less, but because he cared more selectively. His energy no longer leaked into places that demanded performance without offering meaning in return. Caleb began to feel purpose again, not the ambitious kind that chases recognition, but the grounded kind rooted in self-respect. He did work that felt honest. He spoke when something mattered. He listened when silence carried truth. Peace, he learned, is not the absence of struggle. It's the absence of pretending. He noticed how differently he held himself now. His posture softened. His breath deepened. The constant internal negotiation, the one that asked who he needed to be for others, grew quieter. He had stopped trying to prove his worth. And in that release, worth revealed itself naturally. People responded to him differently too. Not because he tried harder, but because he was present. Authenticity had a gravity that effort alone never did. Conversations deepened. Connections felt clean. Fewer, but real. Caleb no longer feared being forgotten. He understood something essential now. The life he had been chasing was never outside him. It was waiting beneath the noise of expectation, beneath the fear of disappointing others. Becoming whole didn't mean becoming perfect. It meant becoming honest. He still struggled. He still doubted. But those moments no longer defined him. They passed through without uprooting him. He trusted himself enough to let discomfort come and go. And standing by the river one evening, watching the water move as it always had, Caleb smiled. Not because everything was solved, but because he was no longer lost. He knew who he was. And for the first time, that was enough. If you've been listening closely, you already know this story was never only about Caleb Rowan. It's about the quiet moments when you realize you've been living carefully instead of truthfully. The times you chose approval over authenticity. The seasons when discipline kept you functioning but not fulfilled. Life doesn't always ask loudly who you are. Sometimes it waits for you to forget, then asks softly. You are not broken because you feel lost. You are not weak because you grew tired of pretending. And you are not behind because your journey doesn't look like anyone else's. Strength is not built by abandoning yourself. Healing begins when you stop performing and start listening. Courage shows up the moment you choose honesty over habit. Letting go is not failure, it's space. Failure is not the end, it's information. Rebirth is not dramatic, it's daily. You don't need to become someone new to deserve peace. You don't need permission to live in alignment with who you are. You only need the courage to remember. So if you feel that quiet pull inside, the one asking for more truth, more presence, more you, don't ignore it. Follow it gently, consistently, with patience. And if this story helped you feel seen, grounded, or understood, share it with someone who might need the same reminder. Like it, stay with this space, because the most important journey you'll ever take is the one back to yourself, and you don't have to walk it alone.